From a literal standpoint, stones are as hard as rocks and tough as nails. However, stones are also a unit of weight in Britain, roughly equivalent to 14 pounds. They're also the centerpiece of sweet fruits such as peaches and plums. Many stones are precious, and some are even painful. Some stones act as extremely useful tools, and some represent the life of a well-loved person or record important historical data or instructions. Doesn't it seem appropriate, then, that this fine family, which we all love, portrays some of these very attributes of the items their name represents? Tough and hard-working, refined by sometimes severe trials, sweet and precious. The Stones family of today and yesteryear fitly deserve the meaning behind their name. Your ancestral name, Stones, has many different renderings: Stone, Stoner, Stones, and Stoneman. Many of them have been called Stony for short, including Grandpa Boyce. The most likely derivation of the Stones family name is that the name is topographic, and as such was given to someone who dwelt by a conspicuous standing stone or a monument. In your family's case, Lancashire, the location of your earliest recorded ancestors, is well known for its widespread availability of durable building stone, which led to the development of quarrying throughout central and eastern Lancashire, where our story starts. Building stone is still produced today, though most of the industry now focuses on crushed stone products. There are actually 3 different ancient crests of the Stones families described in Fairbairn's Book of Crests, but the only one we can find has an eagle displuming a wing. The one from Lancashire says it has a green dragon with a silver collar with a black crosslet between its claws. But the art of heraldry was to show success in battle anciently, so it has little to do with our people from Lancashire anyway, and isn't real important, just very interesting. Notice that the second S is missing from any of the Stones family shields and crests. Just a fact of life we've all learned to deal with, as people misspell the surname. The family motto was Vive ut vivas, which is what's printed on your t-shirts and means in Latin, live to live forever, according to some translations. Let's start our Stones family story with the birth of John Edward Stones, the 5th great-grandfather to you youngest kids here today. He was born way back in 1818, 201 years ago. We don't have a picture of him, but we've got a picture of a coal miner here that might look like him. Born in the middle of the family, number 6 of 13 children, in Worsley, Lancashire, England. John Edward Stones worked hard as a coal miner. It wasn't easy work, and boys often started quite early doing dangerous work at a very young age because they could squeeze into some very tight spaces due to their small size. Look at this type of lamp they wore on their heads to be able to see their way underground. It burned a special type of paraffin wax and could hang on an outcropping of a rock with that little hook built in. Because of the dampness and dirt prevalent in their work, they even used special piece boxes, they called them, that kept their lunch sandwiches sealed against any impurities before they could take their break to eat. At the young age of 19, John met a pretty little girl by the name of Betty Greenhall, who was a year younger than he, and decided to marry her in 1838. This fine couple remained in the Lancashire area, raising a beautiful family of 11 children, all born in Tyldesley between the years 1838 and 1862, a period of 24 years. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Joseph Smith was expanding the great work of the Restoration by sending missionaries overseas. The first LDS missionaries arrived in Liverpool, England, the summer of 1837. Within 10 years, the missionaries of the LDS Church had found the Stones family and convinced John Edward, the father, of the truth of their message. He was baptized in 1847, but it took another 3 years of convincing before his wife, Betty, took the plunge. Then, in 1853, when their son Thomas was 8 years old, he was baptized along with his older brother James, from whom the Stones line continues. Young James Stones probably went into the family business of coal mining at a relatively young age. After his baptism at age 12 in 1843, there were likely a lot of interesting experiences dealing with the rise of the Church of Jesus Christ in Great Britain. Missionaries there were so successful that by 1851 there were nearly 3 times as many members of the church in Britain and Ireland than there were in the United States. The migration of saints from the British Isles to New York, thence across the plains of the United States, under the direction of Brigham Young, had long been underway, with thousands of British saints having made the trip by ship across the Atlantic since those first 7 missionaries arrived from the States to Britain in 1837. The appeal of the call to gather in Zion must surely have grown within both James and his father, John Edward Stone's, breasts. Some circumstance, of which we have no record, kept the father from actually making the journey across the Atlantic as early as his eldest son did. Perhaps James, at age 24 and with only his newlywed wife, Alice, to accompany him, was more quickly able to organize his affairs and prepare for the trip than his 47-year-old father, who had an entire family to attend to. It appears, though, that 8 of John and Betty's 11 children died before they were finally able to make the arduous trip. John Edward Stones, age 47, set sail on the ship Arkwright for the same journey as his son James had made the year before, with his wife Betty and their 15-year-old son John. One other brother, 21-year-old Thomas, also made the trip some 4 years later in 1870. So in total, 3 Stones brothers, all sons of John Edward and Betty, made it to Utah, but none of his daughters lived long enough to endure the trip. All of them used the benefits provided by the Perpetual Immigration Fund and were expected to repay their fare when they became able to do so. Their sea voyage on the Arkwright was not as bad as some the saints endured during the years of gathering, but still they lost 7 people to a watery grave. The passengers were organized into 8 wards, with at least 4 babies born on the ocean voyage. For whatever the reasons, James and his wife Alice, both approximately age 24, set out for America on the ship Bellwood from Liverpool, England on Saturday, 29 April 1865, barely 2 weeks after President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated in Ford's Theater. The news of the president's untimely death had likely reached the ears of James and Alice, but it did not dissuade them from making the month-long oceanic journey. Records show that the ship was chartered by the church. And what a trip it was. With 636 saints on board, the ship made a fairly quick journey across the Atlantic in just 33 days. They had Sabbath meetings and a committee for social events, a small brass band, which included 2 violins, a flute, and a clarinet. The ship's passage was immeasurably more pleasant than James's father's voyage. The following year, favorable winds made the trip quick. And on this ship, the presiding elders formed a brass band and a social committee and even a daily newsletter to keep the spirits up. Only 3 deaths occurred during the voyage, which was many fewer than most. Measles did pop up, but were kept under control somehow. Journals state that upon arrival in New York, everywhere the immigrants looked were soldiers returning home from the Civil War, and that the whole country was mourning the loss of President Abraham Lincoln. The Union Pacific Railroad kept on moving west, and by 1865, when James and Alice arrived from England, Mormons took trains from the East Coast to Omaha. From there, they had to cross in ox teams or handcarts. We cannot find a record of James' trip across the Midlands of the United States, but he ends up in Santaquin, just south of Payson, Utah, where he is listed as a member of the Santaquin Ward. Perhaps he and his wife made the trip independently of the Mormon ox trains. In any case, they had a baby girl in Santaquin in late 1867. Both the baby and the mother died 2 years later, in 1869, within a month of one another. That was the same year the Transcontinental Railroad finally joined the East and West Coasts by driving the Golden Spike in Promontory Point, Utah. "18 months after the death of his beloved Alice, when James was 30 years old, he met an 18-year-old widow by the name of Elizabeth Beard. They married in March of 1871, even though she was 12 years younger than he. She had also emigrated from England earlier with her mother, but her mother died during the crossing of the Atlantic. It is through Elizabeth that our Stones line continues. By her first husband, Elizabeth brought 1-year-old George Crompton into the new family. She and James had a large family of 8 children of their own. James worked as a coal miner and farmer in Utah and Wyoming, and we note that he moved a lot as work became available in different areas around the region. By 1905, at age 65, James was living in Colville. We have record that he planted and cared for the gardens of the Colville LDS Tabernacle until the day he died. One of James' 8 children by Elizabeth Beard was William Henry Stones, grandfather of our own Boyce. He was born 8 May 1876 in Almy, Wyoming Territory, the second natural son of James. The 1880 census shows him living as a youngster with his family in Santaquin. We don't know much about William, except that he was a short, stocky man and worked as a miner and a farmer. His granddaughter, Thelma Winterbottom, remembers that he had an apple orchard and raised some crops in a small field and behind his home on 3rd East and 3rd South in Logan, Utah. He married Martha Marintha Wright civilly in 1896. She was the daughter of Thomas Wright, who immigrated from England. Her father, Thomas, was a prominent man who arose to superintendent of the Wasatch Mines in Colville. All of William Henry's children came through Martha. Martha Marintha Wright were sealed in the Salt Lake Temple a few years later in 1907. Son Horace was sealed to his parents in the Salt Lake Temple on that same date. As a young 5-year-old, along with his living siblings, the trip to the temple must have been a very special day for the entire family. Is there any journal entry describing this significant day? I think there must be somewhere. Barely a year after this joyous occasion in the temple, Martha died unexpectedly of a heart attack, just 2 weeks after giving birth to their 6th child, little baby Martha. She was only 33 years old at the time of her death. In 1915, William Henry Stones remarried, this time to Anne Hansen, also known as Annie Loveland, who had immigrated from Denmark. Per the book, They Came from England, The Rights of Colville, Utah, by Norma Jean Wright Treach, William was an avid genealogist and supposedly left a detailed record of his research to a lady in Brigham City. We need to find that record, as it hopefully has some journals related to some of the Stones family conversions to the church while they lived in England. The third child of William and Martha was Horace William Stones, Boyce's dad. Horace was only 6 years old when his mother passed away, and his dad didn't marry again to Annie Hansen Loveland until 8 years later in 1915. Who raised Horace and the other children during these 8 years? His oldest sister was only 10 at the time. Horace married Genevieve Henderson on the 8th of May, 1926. Their first son, Boyce, was born at the very end of that same year. Their sealing in the Logan Temple happened after his death. Because Horace suffered from very poor health most of his adult life due to accidents that befell him while working to earn a living for his family, Genevieve went to work for Logan Cash Knit as a seamstress, and later for Coleman Knitting in Ogden. She designed the Letterman jackets for high schools around the country, but never got a patent, and so was never paid for her improvements to the design. Horace's first big work-related accident happened on Friday, 28 June, 1929, when he was 27 years old. Boyce was only 2 years old at the time. A boulder broke his leg in 5 places while working for H.P. Nielsen, a mason contractor in Logan, Utah. He received approximately $34 a month for 2.5 years in insurance compensation, plus an offer to pay for the surgery, but it looks like he declined the surgery. The next year, he received a leg brace from the Fitwell Artificial Limb Company in Salt Lake City. His second worst and most widely known accident by the family occurred in June of 1936, a full 7 years after the first. Working for Pierce Packing Company, he and another were lifting a D-Harrer. It slipped, throwing its weight upon me and shoved my back against a protruding bolt. He kept working through December, then finally had to spend some time in the hospital. This is the injury that ultimately led to the seizures that prevented him from being able to work at all a few years later. Less than a year after this accident, a ladder slipped on an oily floor at work, and he fell on his back. He refused medical attention at this time, feeling that it was not needed. Because of these previous injuries, the next work-related incident, less than 2 months later on the 2nd of April of 1937, really started his physical demise. While lifting a heavy armature from a 30-horsepower motor with his workmate's help, his back suddenly contracted severe pain, and he had to give up the effort. He thought he'd be able to rest overnight and go back to work the next day. However, that next morning, he experienced his first convulsion at the breakfast table and scared his poor wife Genevieve out of her wits. A telegram was sent to Horace's dad, William, a few days later, saying that Horace had suffered a bad spell. Doctor gives no hope. Can you imagine as a wife receiving a telegram like that? He spent months in and out of hospitals, including a trip to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. The round-trip airfare rail fare was $76.75 for he and his wife Genevieve. He finally returned to work 5 months later on 27th of September, 1937. Just 6 weeks after returning to work, a gas torch blew up in his right hand. This poor man couldn't catch a break. He suffered a lot of pain over the years, and though the medicines that he was prescribed, Dilantin and phenobarbital, surely helped dull the worst of the pain, they also caused severe stomach problems. In July of 1951, he was diagnosed with scar tissue on his brain that was also caused by these pain meds that he'd been using for so long. His newlywed son, Boyce, was conscripted to help keep the shoe shop open that he ran. Logan police reported that they found Horace slumped over the shoe shop counter or lying on the floor several times after he'd experienced severe convulsions, and they took him home, leaving Boyce to attend to the shop. He lived another year and a half after the scar tissue diagnosis and died on February 24th, 1953, at the young age of 50. This is just a very small part of the great story of your great-grandparents, Boyce and Rita Stones. Born on December 20th, 1926, Boyce came about at the same time as the National Numbered Highway System had just been approved, establishing the famed Route 66. This was a perfect setup for a man such as Boyce, who loved cars and travel. You probably knew that Yellowstone was his favorite place to go. The oldest of the 4 children of Horace and Genevieve, Boyce was born a full 6.5 years before the next child, Bill, came along. He was already 14 years old by the time his youngest sister, Thelma, came. His mother said it was like raising 3 different families. They were so far apart. Boyce got his middle name, Rafael, after a friend of the family's, and there was some slight dispute between the 2 parents as to how to spell it. Was it Raphael with an F, the Latin form, or Raphael with the PH, the English version? To Boyce, it didn't matter. He officially only ever used the middle initial R because, in his words, I didn't appreciate the name much. However, when Pam ordered the actual birth certificate, it came in spelled the Spanish way with an F instead of the PH, which is the way Grandma wanted it. When Pam showed Grandma Genevieve the actual birth certificate, she replied in disgust, "That Horace!" Evidently, the spelling difference was a major concern for Jen, and she didn't realize until that moment that her beloved husband had put it on the birth certificate incorrectly. According to his little sister Thelma, this cute little guy was 8 or 9 years old when the family moved to Billings, Montana, where Sharon was born. Bill had been born in Logan, while Horace was working away from home in Montana. During that difficult time spent apart, Genevieve stayed with her father-in-law, William Henry Stones, and his second wife, Annie Hanson Loveland. Horace's sister, Thelma Barfus, helped Genevieve through the pregnancy and delivery. The 2 of them developed a lifelong close friendship because of that great service rendered by Thelma. By the time Boyce went to junior high school, the family were in Red Lodge, Montana, where Thelma Jean was born. She was named after her aunt, Mary Thelma, and has always absolutely adored her oldest brother, Boyce. Boyce was 9 years old when his father suffered the horrible accident that debilitated him for the rest of his life. Boyce wanted a bicycle, so he mowed lawns to put money on the bike. The storekeeper held the bike for him and was so impressed with this young man's work ethic and determination, that he gave the bike to him before he had finished paying for it. He knew Boyce was good for the final payments. Some time later, they moved to Ogden, but ended up in Logan after his dad bought a shoe shop, having been trained to make and repair shoes through a work rehabilitation program. During his senior year in high school, Boyce felt compelled to drop out of school in order to help his dad at the shoe shop and help provide an income for the family. Even for the 3 years that he later worked at the Union Pacific Railroad in Pocatello, Idaho, he continued to send one half of his paycheck back home every month to help support. His job there was to paint bridges and train depots from Oregon to Wyoming. From there, he returned to Logan to work pressing clothing for Superior dry cleaners. Boyce and Rada went together for quite a while, and, in Boyce's own words, quote, "I decided I'd like to marry her and asked her if she'd like to marry me." So, they were married on the 26th of August, 1950, by Bishop Ken Baugh inside Grandma Tim's home. Guess where they went on their honeymoon? Can anyone guess? And what a honeymoon it was. They stopped the first night in Montpelier, Idaho, and stayed at a motel. During the night, their bed fell apart, right to the ground. "Thought it was an earthquake," Boyce stated. Then, on the way home from 2 days of touring the park, at Fall River, their 1940 Plymouth just up and quit. Rada thought they were stranded and kept asking, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" Thankfully, Boyce happened to have the parts with him that were needed, so they got underway rather quickly again. The story goes that toward the end of World War II, Boyce was rejected from the Army because of flat feet. However, when the Korean War erupted in 1950, his number popped up high on the draft list, and he ended up on the front lines during the hottest and harshest part of that horrible conflict. Did his flat feet miraculously heal themselves during the interval between wars? No. It is more likely that, as the need for new conscripts intensified, some of the strict physical requirements were laid aside. Boyce was assigned to the U.S. Army's 23rd Infantry 2nd Division, distinguished by an Indian head patch. His service number was 560-58532. His platoon included 36 men, and they defended the infamous Pusan perimeter. Boyce's best friend, Kenny Walters, from Manhattan, Kansas, he arrived in Korea on Easter Sunday when it was 20 degrees outside. Quote, "I about shivered to death for 2 weeks after we arrived. Then came the rainy season with lots of mud. At one point, his entire company was surrounded by the Chinese enemy on a mountaintop for 7 days, completely stranded. The only support they received was food that was parachute dropped from an airplane. Meat, cans, ham, and beans. Boyce said, it all tasted the same. Finally, reinforcements came and dug them out. Almost their whole company was replaced or wounded." Boyce achieved the rank of Army Corporal, or E4, which is the 4th level of the enlisted ranks. The closest Boyce ever came to injury was when friendly Air Force troops were out shooting 20mm shells. One shot was misguided and went through his pant leg by his ankle and lodged into the tree behind him. Boyce dug it out and kept it in his pocket for good luck. When he returned, he had the bullet made into a necklace and gave it to his dear Rada. For his service in the Army, Boyce earned several awards which he never received. On December 30th, 2000, 50 years after he endured the rigors of war, then Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Whicker, his son-in-law, presented the awards that should have been given decades before. Because of the emergency circumstances surrounding his return to the United States, Boyce never received the standard separation paper, DD Form 214, which serves as proof of his combat service. A fire in 1973 at the St. Louis, Missouri National Personnel Record Center destroyed a large percentage of old military records maintained there. Among those 18 million fire-damaged records was the record of Boyce R. Stones. However, thanks to a few strings pulled, Grandpa Boyce's burn record was found and served as proof of combat service, so that the appropriate medals, certificates, and badges could finally be properly presented to this war hero. Included among these were the National Defense Service Medal, the Korean Service Medal with 2 bronze stars, the United Nations Korean Service Medal, the Korean War Service Medal, the Republic of Korean Presidential Unit Citation, and the Combat Infantry Badge, also known as the Fighter Badge. His unit must have been in physical contact with the enemy and the soldier personally present under fire in order to earn that prestigious badge. In 1953, while his dad was in the hospital under a big oxygen tent to try to save him from certain death, Boyce suffered a ruptured appendix and was in the same hospital. Neither father nor son knew the other was there. Thelma relates that during this time, while Bill was supposed to take care of Sharon and Thelma got away and ran to the hospital so he could be with her mom and dad. Kids weren't allowed, but the doctor let her go in. Her dad told her that she was going to have to take over, and he died the next day in 1953. Unfortunately, Boyce wasn't well enough to go to his own dad's funeral. When he first came home from Korea, Boyce ran his dad's shoe shop for a while. The shop was later sold to Lee Edwards, so Boyce went back to Superior Cleaners and worked for Don Earl at his service station part-time for several years. Texaco eventually became a very big part of Boyce and Rada's lives. Rada did the bookkeeping while Boyce ran the station. Earl eventually helped Boyce get him into Texaco, where he took over the lease for the South Main station in Logan. He had to pay 2 cents per gallon sold and $150 a month to the company. At one point, during road construction, he almost went broke. However, most of the time, business was good, and it provided a steady living for the family. "I had several catastrophes at work," he once told granddaughter Allison. "Someone will have to tell us the story of that brake failure that caused him to pin Scott against the wall. Terry, do you know that story?" Adding the U-Haul piece to his business was a very profitable adjunct. However, in July 1991, Texaco gave up their leasing program, and Boyce's lease was revoked. Don Earl, the owner, sold the property, and the old station that had meant so much to the family for so many decades was torn down. The corner where it once stood is now a modern Tesoro brand service station. There is so much more to the story of Boyce and Rada Stones, and so much more to everyone's story that have been highlighted in this video. During this reunion, we'll all hopefully have time to listen to some of your reminiscences of these fine people. Boyce and Rada were a quiet, unassuming couple who calmly went about doing good for others without any need for accolades. How we love them.